I was standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tile at 5:43 in the morning when I heard my husband whisper my future into his phone, calm and precise, like he was ordering furniture, and in that second, something inside me went quiet instead of breaking. The apartment was still half dark, the city outside barely awake, and I had come out to drink water because sleep had slipped away from me again, the way it had been doing for weeks, leaving me with a dry mouth and a feeling like I had forgotten something important, something right under my nose. I didn't turn the light on. I didn't make a sound. I stood there with the glass in my hand and listened to Evan say my name softly, not with affection, but with calculation. He said he had already spoken to a lawyer. He said he had timelines and paperwork. He said it would be clean if I didn't make it difficult. And then he laughed under his breath like this was all just logistics. He said we could still live together for a few months. It would save money. He said I wouldn't suspect anything because I trusted him. And then he said something that landed heavier than the rest. He said I was predictable. I remember thinking that the word predictable hurt more than the word divorce, because divorce felt abstract and distant, but predictable felt like a judgment on my entire existence. I stood there while the water in my glass trembled slightly, and I wondered how long he had been seeing me as someone to manage instead of someone to love. I went back to bed without him noticing, slid under the blanket, stared at the ceiling, and waited for the sound of his footsteps, for the creak of the mattress, for the familiar weight of his arm across my waist. When it came, my body reacted on instinct, leaning into him like it always had, and that frightened me more than anything else, how quickly I could still pretend nothing had changed. That morning we had coffee together like every other morning. He asked if I wanted eggs. I said no. He kissed my forehead before leaving for work. I smiled and waved from the doorway. The door closed, and the silence felt staged, like a set after the actors had gone home. We had been married for 7 years. Not the kind of marriage people write essays about, but the kind that looks stable from the outside. 2 professionals, no kids yet, a shared calendar on the fridge, plants that survived, friends who invited us to dinner parties and said we were solid. I believed that too. Or maybe I needed to. Looking back, the signs were there in ways that felt obvious only after that phone call. The way he had started scheduling things without me. The way conversations stopped halfway through. The way his phone never left his pocket. None of it screamed betrayal. It whispered distance. For the rest of that day, I moved through the apartment like a guest in my own life. I worked remotely from the small desk in the bedroom, answered emails, joined meetings, nodded at my screen while my mind replayed his words over and over. I already have it planned. You won't suspect anything. Predictable. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I felt something colder and steadier, a kind of alertness I hadn't felt in years. I realized that if he was planning quietly, then I had time, and time was power. That night, he came home late. Said there was traffic. Apologized in the casual way people apologize when they expect forgiveness automatically. We ate dinner on the couch, a show playing in the background that neither of us was watching. I studied his face, looking for cracks, for guilt, for something I could use as confirmation that what I had heard was real. He looked normal. Too normal. I lay awake after he fell asleep, counting his breaths, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence and the unfamiliar awareness that this comfort was temporary. I thought about confronting him. I imagined saying I heard you. I imagined his face. I imagined him denying it, twisting it, telling me I misunderstood, telling me I was emotional, predictable. Instead, I started paying attention. Over the next weeks, I noticed how carefully he managed his schedule. How often he left early or came back late. How he started suggesting separate plans. How he talked about money differently. Cautious, distant, like it was already no longer ours. One evening he casually asked if I had any debt I hadn't mentioned before. The question sounded innocent. It wasn't. I began keeping my own quiet records. Screenshots of shared accounts. Copies of documents. Notes in my phone about dates and conversations. I checked our lease, our insurance, our savings. I learned more about our finances in a month than I had in 7 years of marriage. I hated myself a little for not knowing sooner. What surprised me most was how normal everything still felt on the surface. We still laughed at the same jokes. We still had sex, careful and familiar. We still texted during the day about groceries and chores. Living with someone who is planning to leave you is like sharing a house with a ghost that hasn't realized is dead yet. One afternoon, I overheard another call. This time I wasn't accidental. I had learned his patterns. I knew when he took calls in the car, parked 2 blocks away, thinking the distance made him invisible. I stepped onto the balcony and heard his voice float up from below, fragmented but clear enough. He talked about timing, about waiting until after a work bonus, about how I would be shocked, but fine eventually, about how he wasn't the bad guy if he did it cleanly. He said he felt relieved having a plan. That night, after he went to sleep, I stayed awake and replayed the sound of his voice in my head. Not the words themselves, but the tone, the ease, the way he spoke, like someone who had already emotionally moved out. I tried to remember when I had last heard him sound that light around me, and the answer scared me because I couldn't find it. The next morning, I caught myself studying my reflection in the bathroom mirror longer than usual, searching for something obvious I had missed, some visible sign that my marriage was already over while I was still inside it. My face looked the same, tired but familiar, and that almost made it worse. Nothing about me had changed, yet everything had. I started noticing how often he framed his detachment as maturity. When I asked why he seemed distant, he said he was just stressed, just focused, just trying to be responsible. He spoke like someone rehearsing lines, calm, reasonable, impossible to argue with without sounding emotional. I wondered how many times he had practiced this version of himself, and with whom. At night, lying next to him, I felt my body tense in small ways I had never felt before. When he touched me, I questioned the intention behind it. When he didn't, I questioned that too. Every interaction felt like it carried subtext I wasn't supposed to read yet, like I was behind on information everyone else already had. One evening, we stood in the kitchen washing dishes side by side, our movements synchronized from years of habit, and I felt a sudden wave of grief so strong it made my hands shake. Not grief for what we were losing, but for how easily it was being dismantled without my consent. He hummed quietly to himself, unaware or pretending to be, and I realized how alone I was in a room with someone who knew he was leaving. I stopped sharing my inner life with him, not out of spite, but out of instinct. When something small happened during my day, something that would normally turn into a conversation, I held it back. I felt myself pulling inward, conserving energy, as if my body understood before my mind did, that this was no longer a safe place to invest emotionally. What unsettled me most was how composed he seemed. There was no anger, no visible conflict, no mess. He treated the end of our marriage like a task to complete efficiently, and I wondered if he saw me the same way, as a problem to solve, an obstacle to navigate gently around. In quiet moments, I asked myself questions I had avoided for years. Had I ignored my own dissatisfaction because stability felt safer than uncertainty? Had I mistaken consistency for connection? Had I trained myself to accept less because it was easier than asking for more? The realization didn't come with drama or clarity. It came in fragments, late at night, early in the morning, in the silence between conversations. And slowly, without announcing itself, something shifted. I stopped waiting for him to tell me what was happening. I stopped assuming I was behind. I began to understand that whatever plan he had, I was already living in its shadow, and I deserved to step out of it before it closed over me completely. That was when I felt anger for the first time, sharp and hot, cutting through the numbness. Not because he wanted to leave, but because he was rewriting our story without my consent, turning our shared life into a strategy document. I didn't want revenge. I wanted agency. So I started doing things differently, quietly, carefully. I stopped adjusting my schedule around his. I reconnected with friends I had drifted from. I met with a therapist and told her everything, including the part where I felt calm about it, and how that calm scared me. She said calm is sometimes the mind protecting itself. I also met with a lawyer. Not to race him, not to surprise him, but to understand my position. to understand what clean actually meant. Knowledge took the edge off my fear. I learned what was fair, what was standard, what I could ask for without feeling greedy or cruel. At home, nothing changed on the surface. We still lived together. We still shared meals. He still thought he was ahead of me. Sometimes I watched him talk, his hands moving, his voice confident, and I wondered if he would recognize me at all when this was over, or if I would remain the predictable version he had invented. The night everything shifted was quiet and ordinary. It was raining, the kind of steady rain that makes the city feel smaller. We were both home early. He cooked pasta. I set the table. At some point he looked at me for a long moment, like he was rehearsing something internally. I felt it coming before he spoke. My body knew. That same alert calm settled in my chest. He said we needed to talk. I nodded and sat down, folded my hands, waited. He started with phrases people use when they think they are being kind. He said he cared about me. He said we had grown apart. He said he didn't want to hurt me. He said this wasn't sudden for him. I let him talk. I let him believe he was leading. When he finally said the word divorce, carefully, like it was fragile, I took a breath and said, I know. The silence after was thick and confused. His face changed in real time, confidence slipping into something like fear. He asked what I meant. I told him I had heard him weeks ago, that I knew about the lawyer, the planning, the timeline. I told him calmly, without accusation, without tears. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. I didn't tell him everything I had done. I didn't need to. I told him I had my own counsel now, that I wanted things to be fair, that I wanted us to treat each other with respect, even now. I told him we could still live together temporarily if boundaries were clear, but that pretending was over. He looked smaller than I remembered, not as a punishment, just as a fact. He apologized, finally, not for wanting to leave, but for assuming I wouldn't notice, for assuming I wouldn't handle it. In the weeks that followed, the apartment changed. Not physically, but emotionally. We moved around each other with awareness instead of habit. Conversations became practical. The air cleared in strange ways. I grieved, quietly, in my own time. Sometimes, while washing dishes. Sometimes while walking alone at night. Sometimes not at all. Living together while separating is its own kind of limbo. We divided shelves, days, spaces. We learned how to be polite strangers in a place that had once been intimate. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. On the day he moved out, he stood in the doorway with a box in his arms and asked if I would be okay. The question was sincere. I told him I would be. Not immediately, not perfectly, but eventually. He nodded, like he believed me. After he left, I walked through the apartment alone, touching familiar things, letting the quiet settle. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel destroyed. I felt awake. I still think about that morning sometimes, the cold tile, the half-light, the sound of his voice carrying plans that didn't include me. I think about how close I came to doubting myself, to staying silent, to letting the story happen without my input. What I did instead wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was slow and deliberate, and mine. And that is the part of the story I hold on to now. Not the ending of a marriage, but the moment I realized I didn't have to be predictable to be kind, and I didn't have to be surprised to be strong.